My half-sister Colleen slid a business card across the boardroom table and told me to call a cab. Not a word to me first, not even eye contact. She just reached into her blazer pocket, set that little white rectangle down, pushed it toward me with 2 fingers and said, "There's a taxi company. They're reliable." I stared at that card for a long moment. The room was dead quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. My ex-husband Philip sat beside her. My half-sister, the woman who grew up in the same house as me for 6 years, who borrowed my winter coat every single January because she always forgot hers. And he didn't say a word. Neither did his lawyer, neither did anyone. That was the moment I understood exactly what they thought of me, and that was also the moment I knew I had already won. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing where I came from. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. My mother worked nights at the hospital as an LPN, and my father ran a small HVAC business out of our garage. We weren't poor, but money was never something we were casual about. You counted it. You tracked it. You didn't waste it on things that didn't matter. My father, Walter, was the kind of man who kept every receipt in a shoebox organized by month. He taught me double-entry bookkeeping when I was 12 years old. Because, as he put it, if you understand where the money goes, nobody can ever take it from you without you knowing. I thought that was just Dad being Dad. I had no idea how much that lesson would matter. I met Philip at a conference in Toronto when I was 31. He was charming in that effortless way that looks like confidence, but is actually closer to carelessness. He laughed easily. He bought rounds for strangers. He wore clothes that fit well and talked about ideas like he'd invented most of them. I was finishing my MBA and he was already running the operations side of his family's company, Drennan Industrial Supplies, a mid-sized distributor that had been around since his grandfather's time. We got married 2 years later. I won't pretend it was all bad because it wasn't. The first few years were genuinely good. I took a position in the company's finance department, just part-time at first, then full-time after we settled in Ottawa. Philip's father, Douglas, was still nominally in charge then, though his health had been declining since his early 60s. He was a quiet man with sharp eyes. The kind of person who says very little but misses nothing. Douglas noticed things about me that Philip had stopped seeing somewhere around year 4 of our marriage. He saw that I was the one who caught the discrepancy in the Winnipeg account. He saw that I restructured the vendor payment schedule and saved the company close to $180,000 over 18 months. Without anyone asking me to. He saw that when our Alberta distribution contract nearly fell apart over a misunderstanding about freight liability, I was the one who stayed on the phone until 11 at night, working through the language with the other side's counsel. Philip took credit for most of it, not maliciously, I don't think. At least not first. It was just the way things worked in that family. The men fronted, the women supported, and somehow the work got filed under the wrong name. Colleen came into the picture about 3 years after I joined the company full-time. My mother had remarried when I was in my late teens, a decent enough man named Barry who had a daughter from a previous relationship. That was Colleen. We were never close, exactly, but we were cordial. She came to our wedding. We exchanged gifts at Christmas. She was 11 years younger than me, and I always thought of her more as a distant cousin than a sister, if I'm honest. Colleen was the kind of person who moved toward money instinctively, like a compass needle. She had a good eye for where the advantage was. When Philip started showing up to family dinners without me, work, I was always told, she was there. When the company started sponsoring a charity golf tournament, and Philip was suddenly very passionate about it, Colleen was volunteering at the registration desk. I noticed. I'm not someone who makes accusations without evidence, so I said nothing for a long time, but I noticed. The year I turned 49 was the year everything accelerated. Douglas had a stroke in February. He recovered mostly. But he was no longer the man he'd been. He moved slower. He tired easily. He started talking about the legacy of the company the way people do when they're quietly thinking about what comes after them. He called me into his home office one afternoon in March, while Philip was at a supplier meeting in Montreal. "Iris," he said, which is my name. Iris Drennan, though I'd go back to Iris Caldwell soon enough. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and I sat down. "I want you to look at something." He had a folder. Inside was a restructuring proposal that his own lawyer had drawn up. A reorganization of the company's equity that would, among other things, formalize the contributions of key employees in a binding way. Douglas had been quietly consulting with legal counsel for months. He told me he'd become concerned that in the event of certain changes to the family structure, he didn't say divorce, but we both understood what he meant. The company's most valuable institutional knowledge could walk out the door without any acknowledgement. You built the systems that this company runs on now, he said. He wasn't being sentimental, he was being precise. The vendor database, the accounts receivable workflow, the Alberta framework, those are yours. I should have made that official a long time ago. He asked me to review the document and, if I was comfortable, to work with his lawyer to formalize it. He asked me to keep it between us for the time being. I took the folder home. I read it 3 times. I called my own lawyer, a woman named Faye who I'd used for a real estate transaction years earlier, and I asked her to look it over too. She told me it was solid. She told me to sign it. I signed it in April. Douglas countersigned. His lawyer held the documents. In June, Philip asked for a divorce. He was very calm about it. He sat down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening and said he thought we'd grown apart and that it wasn't working, and that he hoped we could be adults about it. He was wearing the watch I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. I remember noticing that. I didn't cry. I think that surprised him. I asked him if he was seeing someone, and he said that was a separate matter, which was, in its own way, an answer. The months between June and the settlement meeting were strange. I continued working. I had a consulting arrangement with the company by then, formalized in a separate contract. Philip and I lived somewhat parallel lives in the house while the lawyers worked. He seemed very confident throughout the whole process. Relaxed almost. His lawyer sent aggressive letters. They challenged the value of my contributions. They argued I had been fairly compensated through salary. They made the whole thing feel like they thought it would be over quickly. I let Faye handle the correspondence. I focused on the documentation. The settlement meeting was held on a Thursday in November, at a boardroom in an office building in Canada. Faye had booked it. Philip's lawyer had agreed to the location. It was a mediated session, no judge, just a mediator, both sets of lawyers and us. I arrived early. I am always early. Faye and I sat on one side of the table. We had coffee. We had our folders. We were ready. Philip arrived 12 minutes later, and beside him, in a wool blazer the color of slate, was Colleen. I looked at her. She looked at me. And then she sat down next to Philip like she had every right in the world to be there. Philip's lawyer said she was there for emotional support, and that her presence had been cleared with the mediator. I looked at the mediator. He gave a small, neutral nod. Faye leaned over and whispered, "It's irregular, but not prohibited in mediation." She kept her voice even. "Do you want to object?" I thought about it for about 2 seconds. "No," I said. "Let her stay." The first hour was exactly what you'd expect. The mediator went through the framework. Both lawyers summarized their position. Philip's side came in with an offer that was frankly insulting. A buyout of my interest in the matrimonial home, a lump sum, and a waiver of any claim to business assets. They had a tidy little number at the bottom of their page, and they slid it across the table like they were doing me a favor. Colleen watched all of this with the same expression she always had when she was pleased with herself. A kind of composed, lidded satisfaction. Then, during a break, she produced the business card and slid it across the table to me. "Cab company," 2 fingers, not even looking at me. "The offer is more than fair," she said, still not looking up from her notepad. "You should take it and go home." I picked up the card. I looked at it. I set it back down. "Thank you," I said. She blinked. That wasn't the reaction she expected. We went back on record. The mediator asked if I had anything to add before we moved to the next stage. Faye placed our folder in the center of the table. "Mrs. Drennan would like to enter several documents into the record," she said. The first document was the equity restructuring agreement that Douglas and I had signed in April. It formalized my ownership stake in the intellectual property underlying 3 of the company's core operational systems. The vendor management database I had built from scratch, the accounts receivable workflow I had redesigned, and what the document called the Alberta framework, the liability management structure I had negotiated and written that had since become the template for all of the company's Western distribution contracts. Philip's lawyer picked up the document. He read the first page. He turned to the second. He went very still. Philip leaned over to look. The color left his face the way it does when something cold and real arrives all at once. The second document was a licensing valuation. Faye had retained a specialist, a business valuator certified by the CBV Institute, who had assessed the fair market value of licensing those 3 operational systems away from the company. The number was not small. It was the kind of number that, if the company wanted to continue using systems that were now legally mine, would require a formal licensing agreement and ongoing fees. Alternatively, I would be willing to transfer the IP back to the company as part of a divorce settlement, in exchange for an asset package that reflected the actual value of what I was transferring. Philip's lawyer asked for a recess. We took 25 minutes. I drank my coffee. Faye checked her phone. I looked out the window at the parking lot, and the gray November sky above Canada, and I thought about my father's shoebox of receipts, and his lesson about knowing where the money goes. When we came back, the number on their page was very different. Colleen had stopped looking composed. She was whispering to Philip, and he was shaking his head slightly, and his jaw was tight. She put her hand on his arm at one point, and he moved his arm away. That was the first crack. The final settlement took another 6 weeks to fully negotiate and execute, but the shape of it was decided in that room. I walked out of the Canada office building on a Thursday afternoon in November, with an agreement that included a significant cash settlement, the full equity of our matrimonial home in Ottawa's West End, and a formalized licensing arrangement with Drennan Industrial that would generate royalty income for the next 8 years. Not bad for someone who'd been handed a cab company's business card. The months after that were quieter than I expected. I moved back to the house. It was mine outright once the paperwork cleared, and I spent the first few weeks doing very little. I walked. I cooked real meals instead of the quick things I'd been making for years when I was working late. I called my mother on Sundays, longer calls than usual. She cried a little the first time I told her the full story. I told her not to, that everything was fine, and eventually she believed me because it was true. Faye referred me to a financial planner she trusted. A woman in the glebe, who helped me structure the settlement income in a way that was tax efficient, because we were in Canada and the transfer of the matrimonial home was treated as a principal residence. There were no capital gains implications on that side. The royalty income was structured to come through a corporations we set up in December, which provided some additional flexibility. These details matter. They always matter. My father would have approved. I won't pretend I didn't have hard nights. I did. There were evenings when I'd sit at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and feel the specific exhaustion of having spent nearly 2 decades building something that had someone else's name on it. Not regret, exactly. More like the particular sadness of understanding something about yourself that you wish you'd understood sooner. What I understood was this. I had made myself invisible because it felt safer. I let Philip take the credit because confronting him would have meant confronting the marriage. I stayed small in rooms where I should have stood at the front. That had been my choice, and I had to own it, even as I was also aware that the systems I'd built and the work I'd done had been real and substantial and worthy of recognition regardless of whose name was attached. Douglas sent me a card in December. He wrote it by hand, which clearly took some effort given his recovery. He said he was sorry things had ended the way they had. He said he hoped I knew that he had always known exactly what I was worth to that company. He said the card from Colleen in that meeting, he'd heard about it, somehow, because Douglas always heard things, was an embarrassment to the family name and he was sorry I'd had to sit through it. I framed that card, not to be dramatic about it, just because it was true, and because someone had said it plainly, and that meant something. Colleen and Philip were together publicly by January. I heard about it through my mother, who heard through Barry, who apparently had very mixed feelings about the whole arrangement. They moved into a condo in Westboro. From what I gathered through the ordinary channels of a life in a mid-sized city, things were not as smooth as they'd appeared in that boardroom. Philip's position in the company became complicated when the licensing arrangement required the board to acknowledge, formally, the origin of several key systems. There were meetings. There were uncomfortable conversations. Douglas was not well enough to manage any of it directly, but his lawyer, the same one who'd helped draft my agreement in April, was still very much active. I heard that Philip hired a team to try to rebuild the systems from scratch to avoid the licensing fees. The consultant bill was substantial. The project took 8 months. The result was, by multiple accounts, not as good as what I had built. I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel a quiet satisfaction when I heard that. I'm 53 years old and I've made my peace with the fact that I'm allowed to feel satisfied. I started a small consulting practice in the spring. Just me and a desk in the spare bedroom, a decent laptop, and a list of contacts I'd built over 18 years in the industry. The first client came through a former colleague in Mississauga who'd heard I was available. The second came from a referral from Faye. By the summer I had 4 ongoing engagements and a waiting list for the fall. It turned out that the skills I had spent years applying to someone else's company were just as useful applied to my own. I go to Sudbury twice a year now to visit my mother. We sit in her kitchen, which still has the same yellow curtains she's had since 1987, and we drink coffee and talk for hours. She asks about work and I tell her, and she doesn't always follow all the details but she listens with the full attention she's always given me, which is its own kind of thing. She doesn't ask about Philip. She never really liked him, which she had the decency not to say until it was over. Last October I was in downtown Ottawa for a client meeting, and I walked past the building where the mediation had taken place. I hadn't been back to that block since November of the year before. It was a cold afternoon, that particular kind of Ottawa cold that settles in and means business, and I had my good coat on and I was warm, and I had just come from a meeting that went well. I stood on the sidewalk outside that building for maybe 30 seconds. I thought about Colleen's 2 fingers pushing that card across the table. I thought about Philip's face when the folder opened. I thought about Douglas writing a card by hand, when his hands didn't work the way they used to. And then I walked on. I had somewhere to be. The taxi card is still in the junk drawer in my kitchen, underneath an expired shopper's coupon and a set of keys I can no longer identify. I kept it because sometimes you need a small, tangible reminder that the people who think they're sending you home are occasionally the very people who give you exactly what you need to stay.